The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Gunner Leo Chambers. Leo Chambers was born on the 15th of January 1915 in Mungalala, Queensland, one of 7 children born to grazer John Chambers and his wife Agnes. Leo grew up on his family's property, Riverside, where he received his education via correspondence. He was actively involved in the running of Riverside from a young age, helped with kangaroo culling, horse breaking and shearing. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, Leo was operating Riverside Farm alongside his brother Ronald. Leo Chambers enlisted in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force on the 24th of June 1940, alongside his cousin Eli. He undertook initial training near Red Bank before being allocated to the 2nd 10th Field Regiment as a gunner at the end of July. He was granted a short period of leave in January 1941 before embarking for active service from Sydney on the 2nd of February. After a 2-week voyage, Chambers arrived in Singapore. His unit was initially based around Malacca before moving to Mersing on the east coast. With the increasing likelihood of Japan's entry into the war, the men of the 2nd 10th devoted their time to training and developing their defensive position. In December 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and Japanese forces began their land invasion of Malaya. The enemy's advance did not directly impact Palmer's unit until January 1942, as Allied units were forced to fall back towards Singapore. Chambers' unit was re-equipped with 25-pounder guns and began providing artillery support for troops fighting the Japanese around Merseng and Dao Road. By the end of the month, Allied forces had fallen back to Singapore, where the garrison found itself isolated. As the situation became increasingly desperate, Allied forces prepared to defend Singapore. Chambers' unit was detailed to cover the Johor Causeway between Singapore Island and Malaya. Chambers and the men of the 2nd 10th found themselves in the thick of the action when Japanese forces landed on the 8th and 9th of February 1942. Firing furiously upon boats carrying Japanese troops, they sunk more than 30, but had little hope of stemming the enemy's advance. Their lines were eventually overwhelmed and confused, and scattered fighting took place in the dark as Allied forces were pushed inland. Unable to halt the enemy, Allied units were forced to continue their retreat, which ended with surrender on the outskirts of Singapore City on the 15th of February 1942. More than 130,000 Allied troops became prisoners of war. Among them was gunner Leo Chambers. Chambers and his comrades were placed in a prisoner of war camp at Changi, where they remained for several months. The Japanese soon began gathering groups of prisoners to use as labour on various projects in the Pacific region. Gunner Chambers was among the first group to be sent, joining 3,000 others forming A Force under Brigadier Arthur Varley. On the 15th of May 1942, they were sent to Burma by ship, where they were forced to work on the construction of airfields. Chambers and his comrades remained in various Burmese camps until September, where they were moved to Tan Bao Zayat to begin working on the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway. Engaged in felling trees and clearing undergrowth, they had to excavate cuttings, construct bridges, and build embankments. Suffering under arduous conditions and with limited access to essential supplies, including food and medicine. By mid-1943, some prisoners were working shifts of more than 20 hours under the watchful eye of the vicious Japanese and Korean guards, who frequently subjected prisoners to beatings and violence. The railway was completed in October 1943, and in January the following year, Chambers and the remainder of A Force returned to Singapore. On the 6th of September 1944, the survivors embarked for Japan upon the Rakio Maru and Kachidoki Maru, joining a convoy of ships carrying raw materials. Described by troops as hell ships, the men on board suffered from cramped and unhygienic conditions, sickness and malnourishment on long and difficult journeys. On the morning of the 12th of September 1944, the convoy was attacked by American submarines whilst transiting through the South China Sea. Chambers, who had been suffering from malaria, was on board the Rakio Maru when it was struck by a torpedo from the US submarine Sea Lion II. Some prisoners were able to evacuate the ship and spend days clinging to life rafts and wreckage in open water. 150 men were rescued by Allied vessels, while more than 500 were recaptured by the Japanese. Over 1,500 Australian and British prisoners, however, perished beneath the waves. Among them was Leo Chambers, last seen clinging to a piece of wreckage in the ocean. His remains were never found. Today, with no grave but the sea, he is commemorated on the Lubion Memorial in Malaysia. Leo Chambers was 29 years old. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, among almost 40,000 Australians who died whilst serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today by the Pool of Reflection. This is one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Gunner Leo Chambers, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières, or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the Director, staff and volunteers, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support during the Memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening.